Here's the latest 2 p.m. briefing on Hurricane Irma. Winds are 120 miles per hour. It's just offshore of southwest Florida. It made landfall this morning around 9:10 at Cujo Key with 130 mile per hour winds. And it continues to move to the north around 9 miles per hour. Again, still want to point out the very large tropical storm wind field already reaching up into the central Florida area, and the hurricane wind field reaching into southwest Florida. So very large wind field with the storm still. The track shifted, good news, slightly eastward, but I don't want to read too much into that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more closely here in a minute. The center of Irma is still wobbling around. The eye has kind of filled in and then opened back up. It's still showing some signs of strengthening while it's offshore. But the track forecast and exactly where it makes landfall is a little bit uncertain with the wobbling. So due to the proximity to the coast and those wobbles, the landfall is still possible anywhere from Naples all the way up to the Big Bend. But no matter where the landfall occurs, we do still expect significant impacts locally. Okay, here's a satellite loop so I can show you what I was talking about with Irma and how the eye is wobbling around. You can see how it fills in, and it looks like it's going maybe northeast and then back northwest and north. You want to look at the long-term trends, and while it's on a more northward track, this still could just skirt the coast and still bring us rather significant impacts. Some model data shows it coming ashore near Fort Myers, staying inland for a little while, and then coming back offshore, and some show it still moving eastward and staying inland the whole time. I think we are well aware that the track has been shifting west of most of the guidance for the entire time we've been forecasting this, so I think we really need to still plan for the track along the coast and taking a westernmost route. So our main threats continue to be winds in the extreme category. We'll pinpoint exactly where that is in a minute. Surge continues to be a moderate threat around the Big Bend coast, and the rainfall threat is actually increasing slightly, especially east of state line from Albany through Tallahassee, and the tornado threat still remains low. I've decreased the forecast confidence just a bit based on what we just talked about, the wobbling of the eye and exactly where it's going to make landfall and how it's going to come back offshore if it does at all. So the wind speed probabilities, I'm showing you the one from earlier this morning. This is the same graphic I showed you earlier. I think we need to still expect the tropical storm winds as a certainty in the purple areas, sustained tropical storm force winds, and then a 5 in 10 or an 8 in 10 chance outside of that window, slightly lower as you go further west. So sustained tropical storm force winds still need to be planned for. What you're going to see when you go onto the Hurricane Center's webpage and see their tropical storm probabilities is this graphic here, which show it slightly lower. This could happen if the storm stays on the easterly side of the track, but what we think is happening here is that this is just a computer-generated plot, and it's looking between 2 points, the points that the Hurricane Center puts in. And so it just so happens that the latest point in our area is inland around Cedar Key, and so the winds have been reduced. So it's not sampling where the storm comes back off into the Gulf north of Tampa and strengthens a bit. So I think it's just artificially reducing these values, and I think they're more likely to be what we showed you earlier this morning. So we need to still plan for what we went over this morning. So the hurricane force wind, same thing, same probabilities as this morning, 8 in 10 chance of hurricane conditions across the southeast Big Bend especially, and then a slightly lower chance, but still significant for our region as you spread through central Big Bend and into South Georgia. Similar, not going to harp on this too much, the wind speed probabilities will look lower for the same reason on the hurricane force winds as well. So we'll keep the same wind threat potential, and we'll talk about the same impacts. This will be the graphic you'll find on our webpage. It looks the same as this morning. I think we need to plan for extensive damage to trees and power lines. And, if this system tracks a little bit further east, maybe we look a little closer like what we saw with Hermine, but I still think even with an easternmost track, the wind fields that we've been seeing across central and south Florida would suggest that we would still have more impacts than Hermine, and significantly more if it stayed further west. So still plan for widespread power outages lasting a week or more, especially in the purple areas. The earliest arrival of tropical storm force winds has not changed much. What we have noticed out ahead is we're kind of in a frontal zone up in our area, and we're seeing gusty winds, 30 miles an hour or higher at times, especially when you get into showers. So really, for the remainder of the day, expect those sort of gusty winds as high as 40 miles an hour in isolated gusts. But the onset of the sustained tropical storm force winds is still expected to be this evening around 8 p.m. for the southeast Big Bend and, say, midnight as you head up into South Georgia and southeast Alabama. The storm surge is a little bit complicated. There isn't really an artificial reduction based on where the points are. This has to do more with the track of the storm. This is the graphic from this morning. This would be if the storm tracks along the western edge of the cone. So we can kind of give you a visual of the worst case on the western side of the cone and the worst case on the eastern side of the cone. So the reasonable worst case scenario on the western side of the cone is still just greater than 9 feet above ground at any given point along this the Big Bend here. So it's not going to be widespread just like this, but there's the potential for points along the area where you see red to get greater than 9 feet above ground with the westernmost track. But the reasonable expected values are about 4 to 6 feet of inundation across the central and eastern Big Bend coastlines. And this could start by midnight tonight. Now, if you're on the current track, the eastward shifted track from the Hurricane Center, or if we hang out on the eastern side of the cone, the threat goes down significantly. You see just scattered points of greater than 6 feet above ground near the coast. This still falls in our window if we're expecting 4 to 6 feet, except, if it takes that easternmost track, maybe the 4 would be the expected as opposed to the 6, with points greater than 6 feet above ground being that reasonable worst case. So still plan as the expected being 4 to 6, and you could either have on the western side of the track this greater than 9 foot potential, and on the eastern side of the track you can still expect some surge, but a little bit lower. So the storm surge warning remains in effect all the way around coastal Wakulla County down through Dixie County, and the onset of conditions will be in the next 12 to 24 hours. The rainfall potential, the excessive rainfall outlook remains the same, a moderate risk. Again, this is very similar to the probabilities we get from the Storm Prediction Center, so similar to the threat you would get with a moderate risk of severe weather. Similar to a slight risk for severe weather, those probabilities haven't changed, so we're still expecting the potential for some isolated flash flooding, and a flash flood watch continues across parts of south central Georgia and into the Big Bend of Florida. The rainfall amounts, they're bumping up a little bit. This is they fall in still the same range that we were briefing earlier, but they're kind of coming up to the high end of the range. So we're still expecting 2 to 4 inches in the Panhandle, 3 to 5 inches from Eufaula through Tallahassee, Albany down to Tallahassee. You're getting up to the 4 to 6 inches, 4 to 7 inches, and they've kind of ramped up in the eastern Big Bend. So down in the southeast Big Bend and up through south central Georgia, say Lowndes County, up Berrien County, that kind of, or we could see values as high as getting up on that high end of 10 inches, maybe even 12 inches. And again, the locally higher amounts, the good rule of thumb is to double these values in very isolated locations. So we're not expecting, even with those jumps, much change to the river levels. We're still expecting some minor flooding and action stage scattered around. And again, if one of those gauges or rivers happens to fall under where the locally heavier rain comes, then we could see it pop up a category. The tornado threat remains low with Irma. We do have a tornado watch in effect for Lafayette and Dixie counties until midnight tonight. That's going to capture the beginning threat of this as the feeder bands start to come north. We'll probably, or there's a possibility that will be included in a watch again after that time. Again, the similar areas, the eastern tier of our forecast area in south central Georgia and the Suwannee Valley down through the Big Bend of Florida. So tropical storm conditions are still certain for much of the region. Hurricane conditions are most likely across the Big Bend and south central Georgia still. The surge values, the confidence is decreasing in those higher values from earlier based on the slightly easternmost track, but widespread wind damage remains the main threat. So I wanted to point out one other thing, that even if this storm goes inland in South Florida, there are a lot of models that still show it coming offshore again once it comes off Tampa. So there's still the potential for some strengthening before it comes back into the Big Bend. So don't think we're in the clear. If you see the storm come ashore and move up east of Tampa, there's still the potential for it to come back out on the west side of that cone. That's why I think we need to continue preparing for the values we briefed on earlier this morning.